So now that Link's animation is complete, we can get to more of the fun stuff, which is adding the weapon to Link's inventory and creating an animation that will allow Link to swing it. There are a few things that we need to think about when we're going about creating this kind of feature. So the first thing we need to think about, obviously, is how this is going to affect the render system. So we're going to need to render the sword on the screen when he presses the swing sword button, which on the Nintendo would be the A, but we can choose a key for that on the keyboard. The second thing we want to think about is where are we, storing this data, right? So we're going to create a component that will hold what information, or the information of the sword, so the damage, the SRC rect, that kind of stuff. And then we also need to think about, and this we'll think about actually a bit later, is how it interacts with enemies. And we'll also be thinking about inventory. So in a little while, we're actually going to get to Link having a specific inventory where we're going to hold the information for how many bombs Link has, what other weapons does Link have? Does Link have the boomerang or the wand, etc.? So very exciting stuff is coming up. And while we're still on this topic of animation, we still have this file open. What I would like to do is I actually would like to create the sword object, which includes the SRC rect dimensions that we'll be using. We're not going to store this in animations.js. What I will like to do, though, is I do want to create a new folder. Let's call this folder weapons. And we can just name this weapons.js. And in here, we are going to create a sword object. And we can call this sword1 just to stay with the pattern we've been using to describe this weapon. And this object is going to have a few different properties. So let me comment out a little space that we can work with. It is going to have 5 properties, and these properties are going to vary in their types. The first property is going to be a string, and we'll set it to sword1. And this string property will allow us to match this object to other places in our game. So when we want to initialize this object, we can simply just write sword_1, and we'll be able to find this object right from that string. The next property we're going to have is SRC rect, which you're probably familiar with at this point. But this time, instead of it being an array of objects like how it works in our other SRC rect properties, this is not going to be an array of objects. It's going to work by being an object with properties of other objects, and these other objects are going to be the directions that Link is facing in. Because when we call this property and we want to render the sword on the screen, we want to know which one of these swords we want to render. So we have an up, down, left, right sword. So we need to know where they are on the sprite sheet. So it's going to look like up, X, Y, with height, down, left, right. Left, right. Next, we're going to have the image property. This will start off as undefined, but later we're going to set it to a new image object, and this image is going to contain the actual image of the sword that's being swung. The next property will be path, and that's going to look something like assets link.png. And this is going to lead to the link.png sprite sheet that we're using for the sword. And finally, we're going to have a damage property. So this will just be a number of 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And we're using this property to determine how much damage we should be dealing to the enemy when the hitbox overlines with the enemy. And we'll go into hitboxes a little bit later. But that's generally what we're going to be dealing with this object. So let's now put these values into the sword object, src rect, We can pretty much just follow this to a T. Don't forget commas. We need to determine these values in a second, and I will. Set image to undefined. The path is equal to assets link.png. And the damage, we can just set it to 1 for right now. We'll deal with damage later. So now let's set up some actual values. And before we get to up, actually, why don't we deal with this in order? So we'll start with down, left, up, right, because that's the order of the swords. And so here we are. We need to determine where it is on the sprite sheet. I think last time for this link animation, we decided that it looked a little bit better being -2. The sword isn't exactly as wide as link is, but why don't we stick to that? Because I think that might be the right way to go about this. We can do -2, or even let's do -1 because it isn't as wide. We'll just move it very slightly to the left. The next value, where was the sword here? We used 190. Why don't we try that as well? And then for width, let's do 37.5. Or actually, we need to invert the height and the width because the sword is now, the long way is horizontal. It's no longer vertical. Or actually, no, that's not correct. No, we need this to be 37.5, and this is 75. Yes, because it's going down. Here, it'll be the long way for going to the left, while the width will be 75. Y will be 90 because it's on the same row. And then for the X, let's shoot for about 30-ish. Let's go 30 because I know that most of the sprites are about 20 to 30 pixels wide and long. We'll play around with that, see how that works. We'll move over by 30 again. Keep with the same Y. This width is 37.5. The height is 75. Then to the right, let's do 90. Width again is 75. Height is 37.5. Okay, I think that's fine for right now. So now that we have this set up, we need to add the item to the inventory. Now, ideally, I think it would be best is if we do that within this animation. I mean, that makes sense to me, right? We can structure this in a multitude of ways. We can set up this animation to fire an event. But to keep it simple and to avoid passing yet another parameter into this link pickup sword animation, I think we could just add the item to link's inventory in this animation. So that sounds great, but we need to create some kind of inventory system. And how we've structured this game so far is using the ECS design pattern. And the way we hold data is through the use of components. So why don't we go into our component file and let's make another component for link. And we can call this the inventory component. So class inventory component extends component. Okay. And we're going to have an inventory object. So as this game goes on, Link will be acquiring more and more items, right? He's going to have a sword. Well, he's going to have multiple swords. One will replace the other. But he's going to have a sword to begin. So we can have a sword, and we can set this to undefined. And eventually, this sword object will go into this key right here. So this object will be the value for this key. While we're at it, let's also think about a few other small things. So he's going to have bombs, and that's going to take a number. So we can set this to 0. He's also going to have rupees, 0, and keys, 0. Now he's going to have the wand later, the candlestick, all that stuff, the boomerang. But for right now, we'll keep it to these 4 main items. And there's 2 other things that we want to think about with the inventory. Those 2 things are the active A weapon and the active B weapon. Now, Link always has his active A set to the sword. Since from the moment he picks it up in the beginning of the game to the very end of the game when you kill Ganon, the sword is always the active A. That's easy. The active B is a little bit different. You can sometimes not have active B items. So we'll just leave this to undefined at the moment. Well, both of them will be undefined, but very shortly, active A will pretty much always have a value. Let's pass this to the export object. And then let's go to the registry and make sure that the registry can pick up on this. Case inventory. Const component object, new entity components, inventory is equal to new inventory component, component name, component object, break. Let's go into index.js and let's add this component in the create player function. Inventory dummy, inventory component, name, inventory. And really, this actually doesn't need a component object because everything will be undefined upon creation. So we can just call it inventory. Dummy inventory component. Cool. This player. Let's go to our game. Make sure that that inventory component is being created. That looks good. Cool. So let's go into our animations.js in order to add this sword to Link. And at the end, we can simply just do player, components, inventory, inventory, sword is equal to sword1. Export default, or no, we'll do export sword1, and we can set it to sword1, and we'll also set the active inventory active A to sword1 as well, just like that. Let's console.log out the player. Oh, cannot find weapons. So there's a problem with the path and animations.js. It's because it's missing its file ending. So this player, of inventory. Okay, let's see what's going on. It's probably just a misspelling. Let's see. Yes. Right there. Console log on creation. Console log this out. So inventory on creation. It's undefined. And then let's see the player at the end. Sword active A. Sword right here. Perfect. That's great. And has the values that we set up for it. Let's clean up some of these console.logs because the next part is going to be not complicated, but we're going to need to test out a few things now that we're going to handle the rendering of the sword on the screen. So let's remove all console logs. And what we're going to do next is we are going to now add a property to the animation component that will determine when Link is attacking. Let's go into the animation component. And this property will determine if we're using the attack or the move values. So this is attacking A, or just is attacking for right now. We will get to the is attacking B later. Component, no, let's make it is attacking A because later we're going to have is attacking B. So component object is attacking. We could just set this to false because upon initialization, he will not be attacking. And how this is going to work is whenever we press a button, maybe it can be V or C, we will flip this flag. So let's go down into the handle user input. There we go. And let's add a switch case for this situation. So let's add a case for V. We can make the attack button V. And let's get, oh, we already have the player animation component, so we're good with that. Let's do player animation component is attacking A is equal to true. And we'll also set the player animation component current time of animation equal to date now. And we will only have this happen if the player animation component is attacking is equal to false. And the reason why we're doing that is we don't want Link to be able to just spam sword swings, right? We want to have the animation complete and Link reset back to normal and then be able to swing his sword again. So that's how we're going to do this. And we're going to add a case here for key up. So key up V. And here we will set the player animation component is attacking A equal to false. and the current time of the animation component, current time of animation, just equal to 0 for right now. Let's see how that works. When we go into system, we'll go to the animation system, and we will pull this value out, is attacking A. Oh, and I need to add is attacking A right here as well. Is attacking, just making sure I didn't forget anything. A, okay. Is attacking A. We'll set this as the other possible parameter for animating. And then we have that set. Let's go to our render system. Scroll up to render. And in here is how we're going to be handling the rendering of the sword on the screen. So this logic gets a bit tricky. So feel free to slow down the video and leave a comment down below if you have any questions on how this works. But essentially, we're going to be writing the logic to swing the sword in this if statement. And we're going to first determine if the sword is being swung and if this is the proper entity to even concern itself with attacking. So the first thing we want to do is we want to see if there is an inventory component, because the only entity that will have an inventory component is link. And let me do this. Let me just const entity, this entity's I. And I'm going to remove that entity components. So if inventory, and we also want the animation component. So if we have an animation component and a inventory component, and animation dot is attacking A is true, then we want to handle the sword swing. So the logic is if there is inventory, it must be link. If there is an animation component and that is attacking A is set to true, we must be handling a sword swing. In order to render the sword on the screen, we need to know where link is, which we actually already have right here. And then we also need the sprite of the sword. And if you remember, in weapons.js, we have the sprites right here, or the ones we think will be correct, and we're currently organizing them by the direction that Link is facing in. So let's get his facing, the facing property, and this resides in the animation component. And we can set up a switch case for the possible values of facing. I'll let my editor handle that. Facing. So the 4 possible values are up. And actually, let's just handle it by that order that we defined in the weapons.js. So we'll start with down, and then left, up, and then right. And the default value can be break. And within each one of these cases, we're going to define the sprite and the position component in order to create that entity at the end of all this. So let dummy position sword component dummy sprite position component undefined. Or actually, They won't be undefined because we know that they will have their name. Just the value will be undefined. So let's think about this logically now. When we are swinging the sword and Link is facing down, where do we want the sword to appear? Well, to me, I want the sword to appear in the middle of his body, like he's thrusting it outwards from the center of his sprite. So I need to position the X value for his position component, or for the sword's position component, in the middle of his body. And how we do that is we will let X equal to the X position of Link, or let's change this, sword X, so it's clear. The X position of Link plus the width of Link, but divided in 2. So it's not the full width, it's half the width of Link. And on top of that, we're going to subtract the width, or half the width of the sword, because the sword is going to be in the middle of Link. And if we put the full width of the sword into this X value, it's actually going to push the sword too far off to the right. So let's play around with this value by just subtracting 15 for right now. And for the sword's Y, it's a similar idea. We're going to set it to the player's Y. However, this will be plus the player's height, because we want it to be at the very bottom of Link's sprite, but it won't be too far away from the bottom of Link's sprite. So why don't we we'll just subtract the 15 off of that, because the sword, the bottom of Link's sprite is actually going to be at his feet, and we want it to look like it's coming from his hand, and his hand is not going to be, I'll pull up Link. I'll pull up the Link PNG. The bottom of the sword is not actually going to be right in his hand. Or sorry, the bottom of the sword is not going to be right at his feet. The sword is actually slightly into his body. And also, just as a quick note, we won't be using this actual sprite, and the reason why is because it's a much longer sprite than the running animation, and because we're doing collision by squares and rectangles, it doesn't really work so well with our game in the system the way we set it up. So I'm actually just rendering a sword inside of Link's body instead. So we're going to take this animation, the third from the top, and we're going to render a sword in his hand. Once we have these values, we'll want the sword to be a specific height and width. Let's just set it to 30 or 20. And we'll set the height to 40 to start. Then we will set the dummy position component value equal to X sword Y width height. I'm going to change this to sword width and sword height. Sword width, sword height. Now let's try doing the left. So let sword X be equal to the X value. I think is appropriate, because if we're looking at Link like a square, we pretty much just want to put it in his hands right over here. And this is more or less the first value, the first pixel to his left. And then for let sword Y, we essentially want to go to the Y, but then subtract about half of Link's height. So Y plus height divided by 2. And again, we have to take into account the height of the sword as well. So let's subtract by about 15 just to make sure that we can get it relatively centered into Link's body. We'll set the sword width to 20 and let sword height equal to 40. You know what, actually? Let's set these after. And we'll do sword width divided by 2. Sword height divided by 2. I think that's a smarter way to do this. Plus 15 wouldn't make perfect sense because it's not half of 40. Sword height divided by 2. The next position we want to think about is up. So let sword width be equal to 20. Let sword height be equal to 40. And actually, the width is going to be greater than the sword height on the left and the right. So make sure that the sword width is 40, sword height is 20 for left and right. Then it'll be just up and down will be the same, and then left and right will be the same for the sword width and the sword height. Then for let sword x, we can set it to x plus half the width minus the sword width divided by 2. And then let sword y just be equal to the y value. I think that looks right. Then for the right, let sword width be equal to 40. Let sword height be equal to 20. And for the right, we're going to do let x, or sword x, equal to x plus the width, because it's all the way to the right. And let sword y is equal to y plus the height divided by 2, subtracting sword height divided by 2. I'm sure this isn't perfect. We're going to test this out in a second. Just letting you guys know, I'm aware that the calculations may not be perfect. We will see when we create the entity what we need to fix. But that looks good enough. And then once that is done for the position component, we can simply just render the sprite component by going into this sword constant and just picking out the specific src rect that we need to based on the direction that Link is facing. Now this whole switch statement, this was just for putting the sword in the place that it needs to be when Link swings it. So if Link is on the top left of the screen, it needs to appear in the top left, for example. Now we're actually going to be getting the sprite. So dummy sprite component, or we should do dummy sprite component value is equal to sword 1 src rect facing value. So it'll get that object. So if he's facing down, it's going to get this one. If he's facing left, it's going to get that one. Then with that, we can create the entity. And we can access the registry just from the entity that's being looped through. Registry, create entity. Dummy position component, dummy sprite component. We'll return this. Sword entity. Okay, we can console.log out this sword entity. Okay, so let's go through this. We actually did not need that. Therefore, we do not need this. I initially thought perhaps we would take those src rect values from weapons.js, but that was incorrect. src rect is for sprite. This src rect is for sprite, while this is for the position. And then for, although, did we need the active A? No, it does not seem like we did. An active A is actually an animation anyway, so that wouldn't, or it's not an animation, it's in the inventory system, inventory component. Let's see what we got. Okay. Animation works. We get a not found. Okay. Let's see the sprite. src rect is undefined. Okay, that's fine. Let me see if the src value, yep, undefined. Okay. Let's go back then. And that is because we actually are not passing in this path right here. We are only passing in this object. So this dummy sprite component does not have its path. A dummy sprite position component. That is not right. Dummy sprite sword component. Let's not get confused on what it is. Value is equal to sword 1 path. Path is equal to okay, let's try that again. So a sword entity is being created. Okay, that's good. It's not showing up on the screen yet, but it's there. The src rect is undefined now. Okay, so something is going wrong. Let's see what the src value is. Looks like it's going into assets.linkpng. Okay, so that's working. That's good. And I think that should be correct. I think the problem is we're not passing this src rect properly. What's going on here? We need to set the value of src rect like that, because it takes src rect right here, and then it takes a path right there. Okay, I think that should be better. Cannot set properties of undefined src rect. Okay. Well, that's good. It's a new error. So sword 1 is, it says it's undefined. Let's go to our system. I think it's saying that this value is undefined, which it doesn't like that. So I think we should just set these two empty objects instead. And here's the problem. We need to add a Y. Let's try again. Ah, very good. Okay. It's not exactly what we want, but hey, at least we have something coming up on the screen now. Cool. It looks like to me we're taking a lot from the sprite sheet. This is probably a little too much, right? We're getting all the swords and other items that are on the sprite sheet. So we need to fix the source rectangle for the sprite sheet. So let's go to sword 1. And now we need to realize that perhaps the height is a little bit too great. We'll test it with just one thing though. Let's just do height 40. It's taking too much of the sprite sheet. So we'll test that out. Okay, that's a little bit better. We can see that it's looking closer to us. I think the width is definitely too wide as well too. So why don't we lower it by a lot just to see what we got going on. Okay, he picked up the sword. Let's test it. Oh, that's pretty good. Although I think our calculations were a bit off when we did the when we decided where the sword would show up on the screen, but that's fine, one problem at a time. I think I want to make the width a bit wider and actually, believe it or not, make the height smaller. Let's move it to the left slightly and move it down as well by 2. Or sorry, that will move it to the right. To move it to the left, we go negative. Now let's see. Now that's not wide enough. It looks more like an arrow. I think we need to make it a little wider. So each tile is about 70, I think it's 75 pixels we set it to. Let's set this to 50. Oh, let's go. We're messing with down first. Let's set this to 50 and then we'll set the height to 60. Ah, see, that looks much better. The placement of the sword obviously is not in the hands of Link. So let's fix that. I'm going to take a moment to myself to get these values correct for you guys, so that way you can easily just put them in at your leisure versus experimenting through all of this with me. See you in a minute.